He said my name like we were old friends. "Noah," he said. "I think you might have something that belongs to me." He was standing at my front door in a clean jacket with a calm expression and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Garrett Marsh, the most well-connected man in Cedar Creek, Tennessee. His father had been on the town council. His brother coached the high school football team. His name opened doors in this county the way money opens doors everywhere else. I looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. He smiled a little wider. "My wife," he said. "She gets confused sometimes. Took off a few days ago. I've been worried sick." He tilted his head. "Someone saw your truck on her street that morning." "I drive through a lot of streets," I said. He nodded slowly, then he looked past me into the house. Just for a second, just long enough to make sure I understood what the look meant. When his eyes came back to mine, his voice had dropped half a register. "I'd hate for a misunderstanding to cause problems for someone," he said. "A man in your line of work, commercial license, safety record, those things matter." He paused. "I'd really hate to see something happen to them." I held the door and looked at him, at his clean jacket, at the smile that had been there since he got out of his truck and would still be there when he got back in it. I said, "You should go." He went, but he looked back once at the top of the driveway. That look said this wasn't over. He didn't need to say it out loud. "My name is Noah Calloway. I'm 38 years old. I've been driving long-haul routes out of Cedar Creek, Tennessee since I was 27, and before that I worked construction, and before that I worked my father's feed store, and before that I was just a boy who grew up in a town where everybody knew your name and most of them had opinions about what you should do with it. I never left Cedar Creek. That surprises people sometimes. They assume a man who drives for a living must be running towards something or away from something. The truth is simpler. My mother was here. She raised me alone after my father walked out when I was 9, and she did it without complaint and without asking for help, and I was not going to be the second man in her life to disappear on her. She died 14 months ago, quietly in her sleep, the way she'd done most things, without making a fuss, without asking for assistance. I came home one morning from a run and she was gone. I sat in the kitchen for about an hour before I called anyone. I don't know why exactly. Something about needing a few more minutes of the world still being the way it was. Since then I'd been getting through days the way you get through a stretch of bad road. Carefully, 1 mile at a time, not thinking too far ahead. I drove Route 9 every Tuesday and Thursday. Same hours, same stops, same radio stations fading in and out between the hills. My truck was a 2019 Kenworth, dark blue, always locked. I checked the doors every night the way my mother used to check the stove. Not because I doubted myself, but because some habits are just the shape of who you are. On a Tuesday morning in March, I climbed into the cab before sunrise, started the engine and reached for my thermos, and I heard a sound from the back seat. A small sound. Barely anything. The kind of sound a person makes when they've been holding very still for a long time and their body finally gives something away. I turned around. She was pressed into the corner behind the passenger seat, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around herself. Dark hair. A bruise along her jaw that hadn't fully formed yet. Still purple and swelling. She was looking at me with the particular stillness of someone who has calculated every possible outcome of this moment and doesn't know which one is coming. I said nothing for a second. Someone had gotten into a locked truck, which meant someone had needed to badly enough to figure out how. I looked at her, at the bruise, at the way she was holding herself like she was trying to take up as little space as possible in a world that had already made clear it didn't have much room for her. I faced forward, put the truck in gear, and I drove. Her name was Leah Marsh. She told me that 20 minutes later, when we were on the interstate and Cedar Creek was behind us, and her breathing had slowed down enough for words to come out in the right order. She was 31. She had grown up in Knoxville, moved to Cedar Creek 4 years ago when she married a man named Garrett Marsh. Garrett ran the biggest car dealership in the county. His family had been in Cedar Creek for 3 generations. His father had been on the town council. His brother coached the high school football team. She said all of this in a flat, careful voice. The voice of someone who has rehearsed a story so many times it no longer sounds like a story. Just facts. Just the shape of a life. I asked her where she wanted to go. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't have anywhere." I kept driving. I took her to my house. It wasn't a decision exactly. It was the absence of another option presenting itself. My house was 7 miles outside Cedar Creek on a gravel road that most people didn't know existed. It had been my mother's house before it was mine. It still smelled like her sometimes, in the early morning when the heat came on. Leah stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around like she was trying to memorize it in case she needed to leave fast. I made coffee. She sat at the table and held the mug in both hands and didn't drink it right away, just held it. I understood that. Sometimes you need to hold something warm before you can do anything else. I asked what happened to her face. She told me. Not all of it, not that morning, but enough. She said it had been going on for 2 years. She said the first time she tried to leave, Garrett had found her at her sister's house in Knoxville, before she'd even unpacked her bag. She said the second time he had called in a favor with a deputy he'd known since high school, and she'd been brought back to Cedar Creek in the back of a patrol car, like she was the one who'd done something wrong. She said, "Nobody in this town is going to believe me over him." I thought about that for a long time. I knew Garrett Marsh. Not well, but the way you know people in a small town, by reputation, by the way they carry themselves in public, by what other people say when his name comes up. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays and bought rounds at the bar and showed up to funerals. The kind of man a town points to when it wants to show itself something good. I said, "You can stay here until you figure out what comes next." She looked at me. There was suspicion in her eyes. The earned kind, the kind that comes from trusting people who turned out not to deserve it. "Why?" she said. I thought about my mother, about the years she'd spent carrying things she shouldn't have had to carry alone, about how nobody had stopped to ask if she needed help. "Because nobody stopped for her," I said, "and I've spent a long time wishing someone had." She didn't ask who I meant. She just looked at me for a long moment, and then she looked down at the coffee mug, and then she said, very quietly, "Okay." She stayed in my mother's room. I changed the sheets. I moved the photographs of my mother to the dresser instead of leaving them on the nightstand because I thought it might feel easier to sleep in a room that wasn't watching you. I left a glass of water and a lamp that had a soft bulb. Small things. The kind of things nobody notices unless they've spent time in places where nobody thought to do them. The first morning, I came downstairs to find her already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug, watching the window like she was keeping track of something outside. She had cleaned her bruise with something and it looked worse in the morning light, the way bruises always do before they start to heal. I made eggs. She ate without speaking. Then she looked up and said, "You're going to lose your job if you don't go to work." I said I'd called in, said I had a family matter. She looked at me. "I'm not your family." "No," I said, "but you're someone who needs a day before she has to figure out the next thing." "That's close enough." She looked back out the window. After a while she said, "He's going to come looking." "I know. He's going to come here. Probably." She turned and looked at me directly. Her eyes were dark brown, very steady, the kind of steady that people develop when they've had to hold themselves together through things that should have broken them. "He has friends," she said. "Half the county knows him. The sheriff went to school with him. The judge is his father's golf partner." I said, "I know who Garrett Marsh is." She said, "Then you know what you're walking into." I looked at her across the kitchen table, at the bruise, at the way she was sitting, spine straight, chin up, trying to look like someone who wasn't afraid, even though she clearly was, even though fear was the most rational response to everything she just told me. "I drive an 80,000-pound truck for a living," I said. "I've been walking into things my whole life." Something shifted in her face. Just slightly. Not a smile, but the thing that comes right before one when a person remembers that smiling is possible. Garrett Marsh came to my house on the third day. I had expected him sooner. I'd spent 2 days with one eye on the driveway, but nothing came. Then on Thursday afternoon, a silver pickup came down the gravel road and parked outside the fence, and Garrett Marsh got out wearing a clean jacket and a calm expression and walked to my door like a man paying a social visit. He was 40, maybe 41, broad through the shoulders, the kind of handsome that photographs well and looks slightly wrong up close. He shook my hand before I could decide whether to offer it, and then he said what he said. I've already told you that part. The part about his wife getting confused, the part about my commercial license, the part about how he'd hate for something to happen to my safety record. What I haven't told you is what happened after he drove away. Leah was at the top of the stairs. She had heard every word. She came down slowly, holding the railing. She stopped on the bottom step. "He'll call the sheriff," she said. "By tonight?" "Probably. They'll come here." "Let them." She looked at me. "Noah, he's serious. He's done this before. There was a woman before me. She left town. Just disappeared one day and nobody asked why. That sat in the air between us." "What was her name?" I asked. Leah said, "Dana Purcell." I knew that name. Dana Purcell had worked at the feed store for 2 years before I left. She had a laugh that carried across a room. She had left Cedar Creek abruptly. No goodbye, no forwarding address. I had always assumed she'd found something better somewhere. Now I was less sure. "We need documentation," I said. "Everything you can remember. Dates, what happened, where, who might have seen something." I looked at her. "Can you do that?" She straightened slightly. "Yes. And we need somewhere to take it, not the sheriff's office. There's a domestic violence advocacy organization in Knoxville," she said. "I looked them up once. I never called." "Why not?" She looked down at her hands. "Because I was afraid they couldn't help, and then he'd find out I tried." I said, "Call them now." She went to get her phone, and I stood in my mother's kitchen and thought about Dana Purcell's laugh. The sheriff's deputy came that evening. It was Marcus Webb, who had graduated 2 years ahead of me, and whose daughter was on the same soccer team as Garrett Marsh's niece. He stood on my porch with his hat in his hand and a carefully neutral expression. He said there had been a report of a missing person. He said he just needed to verify everything was fine. He said it was routine. I said Leah Marsh was not missing. I said she was a grown woman who had chosen to leave her home. I said she was not required to return to it. Marcus looked past me into the house. "She here voluntarily?" "Yes. I'd need to hear that from her." Leah came to the door. She stood beside me, and I saw Marcus's eyes go to her face, to the bruise which was now yellow at the edges and spreading. He looked at it for exactly 1 second before he looked away, which told me everything I needed to know about Marcus Webb and what he was going to do with what he was seeing. "I'm here because I want to be," Leah said. Her voice was steady. "I am not missing." Marcus nodded. He said he'd file the report. He said if she needed anything she should call. He said it the way people say things they don't mean while technically saying them. He left. Leah let out a breath. "He's going to tell Garrett exactly what I'm wearing and how I look." "I know," I said. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." "I know that too." She turned and looked at me. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not fear. Something more complicated than either. She said, "You didn't have to do any of this." I said no. But here we are. What happened next came faster than I expected. By Friday morning, someone had called my dispatcher and filed a complaint. Anonymous but detailed. Claimed I had a history of erratic behavior on the road. Claimed there had been incidents that hadn't been reported. It was specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be impossible to disprove quickly. My dispatcher called me at 7 in the morning. She was apologetic but firm. Pending investigation, I was off the schedule. I stood in the kitchen with my phone in my hand after she hung up and felt the particular cold of a threat that has just become real. Leah was watching me from the doorway. "Your job?" she said. I said yes. She crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table. She put her hands flat on the surface. Her jaw was set. "I'll go back," she said. "This isn't worth it. Your livelihood." "Leah." "Noah. He wins every time. He always wins. He has been winning for 4 years, and he will keep winning because that's what men like him do in towns like this, and I am so tired of watching people pay the price for it." "Leah." I sat down across from her. "Look at me." She looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw hadn't moved. I said, Did you call the organization in Knoxville? Yes. What did they say? She was quiet for a second, then, they said they could help. They have a lawyer who handles cases like mine. They said the pattern of behavior, the deputy, the previous incident with Dana, the complaint to my dispatcher, they said it's actually useful. It shows escalation. It shows a system being used. I said, then that's what we do. We document everything. Every call, every visit, every threat. We give it all to them. She stared at me. He could do more than take your job. I know. He could. I know, Leah. I kept my voice even. I know what he could do. I also know what happens if nobody does anything. I know because there was a woman in this town before you and she just disappeared and nobody did anything and I have to live with the fact that I didn't ask why. The kitchen went very quiet. Then Leah said, voice barely above a whisper, "Your mother." I looked at her. She said, "You said the first night, you said nobody stopped for her. You meant your mother." I had not planned to tell her this, but she had already understood it, which meant there was no point in not confirming it. "My father," I said, "when I was young, she never told anyone. She thought it was her fault. She spent her whole life believing that." I looked at the table. She was the strongest person I've ever known, and she spent 30 years apologizing for things that were never her fault. Leah didn't say anything. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She didn't squeeze it, just placed it there. We sat like that for a long time. The lawyer from Knoxville came the following week. Her name was Patricia Odom. Small, precise, the kind of woman who takes notes by hand and asks the same question 3 different ways to make sure she has the full answer. She sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours with Leah and a legal pad and a recorder, and when she was done, she looked at me and said, "This is enough, if we can get Dana Purcell." "Dana left," I said. "Years ago, nobody knows where," Patricia said. "That's not exactly true. People always know where. They just don't always say." She made calls. It took her 6 days. Dana Purcell was in Memphis. She had changed her last name. She had a job and an apartment and a life she had built very carefully on the foundation of having gotten away. When Patricia called, Dana was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Is she safe?" Patricia said yes. Dana said, "Then I'll come." I thought about that laugh, the one that used to carry across a room. I thought about how much it costs to make yourself smaller so that someone else feels bigger. Garrett Marsh escalated exactly the way Leah had said he would. The week Dana agreed to come forward, someone slashed the tires on my truck. I found them flat in the morning, all 4, neat cuts, the kind that take intent. I photographed everything. I filed a police report with the county department, not the local sheriff's office. I sent copies to Patricia. 2 days later, someone threw a rock through my front window at 2 in the morning. It landed on the kitchen floor 6 feet from where I was sitting. I swept up the glass, boarded the window, photographed the rock, filed another report. Leah found me in the kitchen afterward. She looked at the boarded window and then at me. "This is what he does," she said. "He makes it uncomfortable until you give up." "I grew up in Cedar Creek," I said. "Uncomfortable is something I have a lot of experience with." She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face was changing, had been changing slowly over the past 2 weeks, in ways that were hard to name. The weariness was still there, but underneath it something else was starting to show through, the way light shows through ice when the cold begins to break. She said, "Why are you like this?" "Like what?" "Like steady, like nothing moves you." I thought about it honestly. "Things move me," I said. "I just don't have anywhere to put it when they do, so I keep going." She looked at the boarded window. "Your mother made you this way." "She made me most things," I said. Leah nodded slowly. Then she said, very quietly, "She sounds like someone I would have liked." I looked at her, and something I had been careful not to name for 2 weeks shifted in my chest and became something harder to ignore. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of April. Garrett Marsh's lawyer tried to have it postponed twice. Patricia blocked both motions. Dana Purcell drove up from Memphis the night before and stayed in the spare room, and the 3 of them sat at my kitchen table until midnight, going through everything one more time. I stayed in the living room. I could hear their voices through the wall, low, serious. The particular cadence of women who have decided something and are making sure every detail is right. At some point, Dana laughed at something. It was the same laugh I remembered, the one that carries across a room. I sat with that for a while. The morning of the hearing, Leah came downstairs in a dark blue dress I hadn't seen before. The bruise was faded now, just a shadow at the jaw. She looked like herself. Whatever the version of herself was that existed before 4 years of being slowly reduced. She stopped when she saw me looking. "Too much?" she said. "No," I said. "You look like someone who's going to win." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Come with me, to the courthouse." "Leah, you don't have to say anything. She stopped, started again. "I've walked into a lot of rooms alone in the last 4 years. I don't want to walk into this one alone. I got my jacket. I won't describe the hearing in detail. Some things belong to the people who lived them, and that morning belonged to Leah and Dana more than it belonged to me." I sat in the back of the room and watched. Dana Purcell testified for 40 minutes. Her voice shook twice and then didn't shake again. She described things with a specificity that left no room for interpretation. She had kept records, dates, photographs, texts she had screenshotted and stored on a cloud account he didn't know about. Patricia had told her to do that years ago, and she had done it, and now those records were in front of a judge. Leah testified after her. She was calmer than I expected, the kind of calm that comes from having already decided that the worst thing that can happen is you fail, and you've already survived the worst, so there's nothing left to fear. She spoke clearly. She didn't look at Garrett Marsh once. I did. I watched him the whole time she spoke. I watched him sit very still with his hands folded on the table in front of him. And I watched his jaw work once when Dana described something specific, and I watched his lawyer lean over and say something into his ear that made him go even more still. The smooth expression he'd walked in with was still there, but it was working harder than it had before. I could see the effort in it now, the way you can see the strain in a structure that's bearing more weight than it was built for. I watched Garrett Marsh's face during the testimony. He sat very still. His lawyer put a hand on his arm once, and he looked at the hand like he didn't know what it was. When the judge spoke, the room was very quiet. The protective order was granted, permanent. The prior incident with Dana was entered into the official record. The complaint filed against my dispatcher was traced back to a call made from Garrett Marsh's personal phone. My dispatcher reinstated me before the afternoon was over. Garrett Marsh walked out of that courtroom with his lawyer and his clean jacket and his steady expression. But the town had been in that room. Cedar Creek had been watching. And the particular thing about small towns is that they remember what they see, even when they pretend they don't. He still lives in Cedar Creek, but he is smaller now. Smaller in the way that men get when the version of themselves they showed the world turns out not to be the real one. After the hearing, we sat on the courthouse steps. Dana had somewhere to be. She was driving back to Memphis that evening. She hugged Leah for a long time. She shook my hand and held it with both of hers and said, "She told me what you did, taking her in." She paused. "Your mother raised someone good." I didn't know what to say, so I just said thank you. Dana left. Leah and I sat on the steps in the April sun. She said, "I don't know what I do now." I said, "You don't have to know yet. I have no money. I have no job. My things are still in that house and I don't know if I can go back for them." "We'll get your things," I said. "Patricia will arrange an escort. It's standard." "And then what?" I looked at the street in front of us. Cedar Creek in April. The dogwoods were coming out along the courthouse square, the same ones that came out every year, indifferent to everything that happened beneath them. "There's a room in my house," I said. "That's been my mother's room and then your room. It has a good lamp and a window that faces east and gets the morning light." She was quiet. "I'm not saying that's forever," I said. "I'm saying that's the next thing, if you want it. Until the next thing after that makes itself clear." She looked at me. The weariness was still there, It would probably always be there, some version of it, and I understood that. Trust is rebuilt the way roads are rebuilt. Slowly, one section at a time, and only if the conditions are right. But underneath the weariness, that other thing, the one I had been watching emerge over the past month like something that had been buried under hard ground and was finally finding its way through. She said, "The east-facing window," I said, "gets the light around 6:30. She looked at the dogwoods, then back at me. "Okay," she said. She stayed. That was spring. By summer, the east-facing window had her plants on the sill, 3 of them, small and green, the kind she said were hard to kill, which she said with a look that told me she was talking about more than plants. She found a job at a veterinary clinic in town. She was good with the animals, precise and gentle, talking to the scared ones in a low voice that settled them down. The clinic owner told me once, unprompted, that Leah had a gift for knowing when an animal needed quiet and when it needed sound. I thought about that for a long time. Cedar Creek was complicated about her. Small towns have long memories and divided loyalties, and Garrett Marsh had spent years making his loyalties easy to track. Some people remained cold. Some crossed the street. There was an afternoon in June when Garrett's brother came into the veterinary clinic and stood at the counter and looked at her for a long time, and then said quietly that it was interesting how some people couldn't let things go. Leah wrote it in the notebook. Date, time, exact words, any witnesses. Patricia had told her to keep documenting. She documented everything, the looks, the comments, the car that sat at the end of the road for 40 minutes one evening before driving away. Each entry was precise and factual, written in Leah's careful handwriting, building a record that no one could dismiss as imagination or exaggeration. She showed me the notebook one night. I read it in silence. When I looked up, she was watching me. "He's going to keep doing this," she said, "until something stops him or until I leave." "You're not leaving," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "You sound sure about that." "I am," I said. She looked back at the notebook. Something in her face softened, just slightly, just for a second. Then she closed it and put it away. But some people came around. Marcus Webb stopped me in the hardware store and said stiffly that he should have looked closer at that bruise. Rosa, who ran the diner, started putting an extra piece of pie on Leah's plate without being asked, and then pretending she hadn't noticed. That was Rosa's version of an apology and an acceptance all at once, and Leah understood it perfectly. One evening in late July, we were sitting on the back porch after dinner. The light was going long and gold the way it does in Tennessee in summer. Leah had her feet tucked under her on the old porch swing that had been my mother's. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. "That morning, when you found me in your truck," she looked at the yard, "you didn't ask any questions. You just drove. Why?" I thought about it. "You said please," I said. "Most people who are in real trouble don't say please. They demand, or they threaten, or they cry. You said please." It was the most frightened word I'd ever heard someone say that quietly. I paused. "And you were in a locked truck, which meant you'd needed to get there badly enough to figure out how. That's not something you do unless you're out of options." She was looking at me. That look I had trouble naming. "I kept waiting for you to make it complicated," she said. "People always make it complicated. There's always something they want from it." "I wanted you to be okay," I said. "That's all I wanted." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know. That's the thing I kept waiting to not be true, and it kept being true." The swing moved slightly. The light went another shade of gold. She said, "Noah." I said, "Yeah. I think you should know that when I got into your truck, I didn't expect any of this. I just needed to get away. And you turned out to be," she paused, "you turned out to be the kind of thing I'd stopped believing existed." I looked at her in the long summer light. "What kind of thing is that?" I said. She said, "Safe." The word settled between us like something that had been waiting a long time to be said. I reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, just the way you take someone's hand when you've decided that's where your hand belongs. She looked down at it, then she looked up at me. and she didn't pull away. By the time the first frost came in October, the east-facing window still had her plants on the sill, and the room they were in was no longer a guest room. It was just a room where someone I loved kept her things. Dana Purcell came back for Thanksgiving. She sat at my mother's table and ate too much, and talked too loudly, and laughed the laugh that carries across a room. And the house felt more full than it had since my mother died. One morning in November, Leah came downstairs while I was making coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I need to tell you something." I turned around. She was holding something small and white in her hand. She said, "We're going to need a bigger porch swing." I stood very still. Then I crossed the kitchen and I put my arms around her and she put her face against my shoulder and we stayed like that for a long time. In my mother's kitchen, in the house on the gravel road, while the coffee finished brewing and the morning light came through the east-facing window and landed on the plants she had put there, because she said they were hard to kill. I thought about the first morning she sat at that table, the way she'd held the mug without drinking from it, the way she'd looked at the window like she was tracking something outside. I thought about all the mornings between then and this one, the ones where she ate without speaking, the ones where she laughed at something I said, and looked briefly surprised by herself. The ones where she sat across from me and said difficult true things because she had decided that honesty was worth more than comfort. I thought about how a house changes when someone decides to stay in it. Some things are hard to kill. The right ones, the ones worth keeping, they find a way through. Garrett Marsh lost the dealership 18 months after the hearing. Financial irregularities, a lawsuit from a former employee, a pattern of behavior that became harder to explain away once people started looking. He left Cedar Creek eventually. Nobody threw a party. Nobody needed to. Dana Purcell got promoted at her job in Memphis. She texts Leah photographs of her apartment sometimes. The way it looks different now that she's filled it with things she chose herself. Our daughter was born in July. We named her Frances, which was my mother's middle name. She has Leah's eyes and my stubbornness, which Leah says is redundant. She sleeps in the room with the east-facing window now, in the crib that used to be my mother's sewing corner, in the house on the gravel road that most people don't know exists. Some mornings I stand in the doorway of that room and watch the light come in. France is asleep, one fist curled beside her face, breathing the slow, steady breath of someone who has never had a reason to be afraid of the morning. Leah comes and stands beside me sometimes. We don't say anything. We just stand there in the doorway together and watch our daughter in the light. I think about all the ways this almost didn't happen. I think about all the mornings I drove Route 9 alone and came home to a quiet house and didn't know what was missing because I had never had it. I think about my mother in that same kitchen, carrying things she shouldn't have had to carry, and I think about how sometimes the things we inherit are not objects or money, but patterns. The shape of silence, the habit of endurance, the particular way of going on that gets handed down without anyone meaning to hand it down. I think about that Tuesday morning in March sometimes. I think about reaching for my thermos. I think about that small sound from the back seat. I think about the words she used. Please. I think about what it takes to say that word. How much you have to have already lost before please becomes the only thing you have left. And I think about how a locked truck became a kitchen, became a porch swing, became a room with plants on the sill, became a daughter sleeping in the morning light. All of it from one word. Please. Just drive. So I did.